Hello, hello. All this talk of potentially seedy business dealings with cryptocurrencies reminded me of a story I wrote a couple years ago. Enjoy. It's a double-edged sword to interview for a job where you interview people for jobs. On one hand, you know all the tricks of the trade. You know how to carry yourself, which questions to ask, and most importantly, the optimal responses to questions. On the other hand, they know you know. I drove around the block after missing the parking lot entrance. While I identified many fire exits, the 3-story office building only had one entrance. I nearly pulled into what I thought was an underground parking garage before I saw it was the shipping receiving doors at the end of the driveway. I found a space and walked up to the building. There was a smoking shelter off to the side where 2 men and 1 woman were conversing. It's important you leave a good impression on everyone you meet, as you never know whom might be your interviewer. I had a good day, locked and loaded, but they paid me no mind. I couldn't help but notice that while 2 were wearing business casual, 1 man was wearing what appeared to be a brown velvet robe. I took care to be cordial with reception and waited in the large foyer. The company I was applying to established their corporate headquarters in my state several years ago. I'd rather not say which one, but I suppose that might not matter. There were only 3 doorways in the copious space. The double door I entered through, the entrance to a fogged glass meeting room, and a single door behind the reception desk. That was the door being primarily used by everyone. A woman in another brown velvet robe burst out of the single door and briskly strode across the room. Her head was shaved, and when I thought about it, so was the robed fellow outside. I was supposed to be meeting with a Mr. Moore. They didn't give his title. Through research in the company, I knew this facility manages virtual currencies information technology development, as well as its regulatory controls. Mr. Moore finally came out of the single door and invited me into the meeting room. He was a tall, bespectacled man, probably in his late 40s. He had an air of importance about him. I expected the higher-ups would want to vet me personally. If anything, it was strange there was only one. I was systematically crushing the interview when Moore abruptly asked me, "What's the worst thing you've ever done?" "Excuse me?" I asked, taken aback. This was unprecedented. How was I supposed to answer honestly and still be successful? It doesn't have to be illegal. Perhaps just something in a morally gray area. I sheepishly gave him a story about how I paid for a plagiarized paper in college, and he nodded his head in approval. Good. Now, have you ever seriously considered taking a human life?" I chuckled nervously. I mean, sometimes. Don't we all? I said seriously. He interrupted, looking over the top of his glasses. I should have walked out, but I knew what he wanted to hear. Despite the unorthodox metrics Moore must have been using, I was in my element. The questions got darker, but they also got easier. Once I realized security wouldn't remove me for what I was saying, the depravity just flowed. I'm not proud of what I said. I was in the middle of explaining which family member I would sacrifice for the sake of the others when Moore slapped his hands on the table. "I've heard quite enough," he shouted as he stood up. There was a long pause as his piercing gaze shattered my conviction. "Welcome aboard." A smile spread across his face when he shook my hand. "Orientation will start immediately. I hope you didn't have any plans." I tried to tell him that I'd first like to consider the offer, but he just smirked and walked out of the room. I followed him through the busy single door into a long hallway. I passed an alcove on the right, which branched off in 2 directions. A few steps behind us, another robed man exited the alcove. I looked behind him to see 2 more employees in plainclothes going in. At the end of the hallway, Moore scanned his ID badge to gain access to a blue security door on the left. "This wing houses our technical operations and our policy analysts," he explained. We proceeded up through the levels of cubicle jungle, and he introduced me to various departments. The tour came full circle, and we exited into the hallway. Across from us was a red security door, granting passage to one of those cloaked people. "There is one more thing you'll need to know," Moore began. You're in a rather unique situation in that you need to have context for the roles of all staff on site. He used his ID on the red door and ushered me through. Beside yet another door was a large man in a black uniform. When I got closer, I noticed he was wearing ballistic armor, but I noticed the assault rifle immediately. Moore took me aside as the guard patted down a line of robed people in front of us. Time is money, as they say. A person's skills and knowledge are compensated at a rate commensurate with their country's GDP. Before that, people dug up shiny yellow rocks and did the same. These things only have value because of the difficulty of procurement and the human life it consumes. I want you to keep that in mind. It was our turn to be examined. Hello, Greg. How are the kids? Greg's stony face cracked into a wide grin. Very well, sir. Michaela's going into middle school. Ah, the time flies, Moore said whimsically as he completed his retinal scan. After climbing down one level of stairs, we turned the corner to find a massive concrete room. We stood on a catwalk on top of metal stairs which led down into the room. There was so much to take in, but I was drawn to a restrained woman who was struggling against two of those black-clad armored guards. Similarly, an older, heavier woman and a skinny young man were flanked by guards of their own. They were escorted to the 3 metal slabs in the center of the room. Perfect timing. We're right at the start of a fresh cycle. It's less jarring this way. The guards forced the 3 to lay down on the slabs and clamped steel built-in clasps around their torsos. Then they ratcheted their limbs and heads down with leather straps. The older woman tried to be as uncooperative as possible. The young man went along meekly. At the end of the room, there was a large cage with hundreds of gagged people shackled to bars on the floor, forming an orderly grid. On the back wall of the enclosure was the loading bay door I saw earlier. A pedestal topped the cage, and beyond it stood someone in a more ornate brown velvet robe. They wore a crude mask that seemed stitched together with hunks of burnt leather. An ancient-looking tome rested on the pedestal. Cryptocurrencies use a technology called blockchaining, but I know you Googled it often enough last week. What we're searching for is a way to satisfy our hash function by finding the correct number used only once. Muffled cries of the women rose as robotic articulated arms descended from the ceiling. Each arm ended in a 3-pronged dexterous claw which spun at the wrist like a gyroscope. The tip of each prong glowed white as they made a pass over the terrified subjects. The robed personnel encircled the slabs, forming 3 rings, each comprising 6 members. They began chanting, a dialect so harsh and alien that it belied the capabilities of human speech. The white glow focused into a blue beam which shot into the throats of the poor souls on the slabs. A cacophony of primal anguish exploded into the air, and as if someone was turning down a volume dial, it gradually muted. The lack of sound did nothing to ease the contorted faces of the victims, as blood rolled out between their gags. That's just a quality of life thing for the staff. The younger woman's eyes stopped rolling in her head and sharply focused on me. I supposed I looked out of place in the scene. I was straining to maintain my composure. "What's going on here?" I whispered. Moore answered my question with a question. "Did you know that DNA differs from person to person by only 0.06%? And the amount of variance of the cells in your own body is dramatically less than that." The figure in the elaborate robe held a tome over their head. I could see gilded alphanumeric text written on the front of the book. The mechanical arms moved down the slabs and began to drag the blue light across the subject's feet. Each methodical pass eroded a layer of skin, then muscle, then bone. The arms desynchronized and set to their work. Like reverse 3D printers, they expertly took swaths of flesh, leaving only arteries and veins. What remained of a completed section resembled a grotesque living medical diagram with a circulatory system. Moore waved a hand in my face before continuing. "But hidden deep in that discrepancy is the number we're looking for. These machines unravel DNA and we have to sift through all the duplicate information to find that one tiny spark. The ghost in the code. Moore snapped out of his musings and made a sweeping gesture at the writhing forms. What you see before you is almost 1 trillion terabytes of data to analyze. Luckily, there are thousands of unwitting miners that led their considerable processing power to the cause. Moore turned back to me. Remember, I told you, currency only has value because of life and effort. The machines were brutally efficient. The limbs were completely gone, and gaping holes were carved into the abdomens. The beams gingerly adapted to organs slipping free and softly plopping onto the slabs. The chanting grew louder, which caught Moore's attention. Now, I'll tell you the things I don't know. For whatever reason, we've never found the number without the help of those hoodies over there. I suppose you could ask them if you're curious. He leaned in. Personally, they creep me out a little. I don't know why we only find them in humans. Believe me, it would be so much more efficient to use rabbits or mice. We've tried some pretty exotic things, he said with a reminiscent grin. I don't know why the person has to be alive and conscious. The logistics of dealing in corpses sounds lovely, but alas. And don't get me started on the expensive drug cocktails we gotta pump them with. The woman's pleading stare never wavered. I hope I wordlessly conveyed I was as helpless as she was. We never know where we'll find it, Moore said as he poked my stomach. It might be in a superfluous fat cell, or it might be in the depth center of your heart. Everyone has one. He eyed me up. I've never heard of a company finding it in a fingernail or eyelash or some such. Neither the skinny man nor his automated butcher had moved in a while. So, phase 1 is less invasive. We've refined the procedure to only take non-essential material. If nothing turns up, the clock starts ticking, and we're forced to harvest as much life-sustaining tissue as possible, until we find it or run out of time. To ensure the success of every cycle, 3 units are processed at a time. On average, the cycle takes 10 minutes. A spotlight turned on above the older woman. The robed people immediately stopped chanting and broke ranks. They walked off in the same direction, congregating around a water cooler. I saw a few hands exchange money and I heard casual conversations blooming. Moore addressed the room and introduced me. The crowd of cultists greeted me like a kid on his first day at school. The important-looking person in the leather mask was now sitting on a folding chair, leafing through a paperback. They gave me an enthusiastic wave. As some pathetic mercy, the arms took aim at the foreheads of the 2 surviving women. They fired a quick burst of red light. All 3 arms moved in unison again, as wide red beams disintegrated the remains. Then they moved into detail under the restraints. That woman, that cultist I saw earlier in the foyer, was making her way up the stairs. That's like your 4th coffee run today, Jessica. A voice called from the throng. Jessica pulled her hood lower and brushed past us. My head was spinning. It was all I could do to keep from retching. I knew I was the one in danger now. I needed to continue to play along. Moore gave me a bracing slap on the back. It's a lot to take in, but you're a hardened pragmatist, right? He said in a sarcastic tone. Give Socks a pet for me when you get home, will you? And oh, you'll have to pick him a carton of milk. The one in your fridge is expired. I have to disappear. I won't be a party to that massacre. I bet they didn't anticipate I'd post this, though. At least, this is one thing I can control. I'm not kidding myself. I know my chances are slim. I saw the glint in Moore's eye when he showed me out and said, either way, you'll be in human resources on Monday.